I went to go see There Will Be Blood when I was 18, and I was absolutely floored that movies could be this good. It was like seeing a new color. In college, I went back and watched everything Paul Thomas Anderson had made before There Will Be Blood and deeply anticipated everything he made after There Will Be Blood. And I think the movies he's made since have been great, like really great, but I will admit that each one was just a tiny bit of a letdown only because I was comparing them to seeing a new color. I'm not saying one battle after another is as good as There Will Be Blood. Few, if any, movies are. But what I am saying is that this is the movie I've been waiting for. No hedging, no minor letdown, just holy shit, he did it. This is the movie I've been waiting for half my life. When the movie was in production, reportedly the working title was The Battle of Backton Cross because the movie takes place mostly in the fictional town of Backton Cross, California, where one Bob Ferguson, played by Leo DiCaprio, is living in hiding with his daughter Willa, played by Chase Infinity in her feature film debut. Bob and Willa have been living in hiding under assumed identities for the past 16 years because Bob used to be the munitions and explosive expert for a radical revolutionary group called the French 75. After a bank robbery goes wrong and turns deadly, much of the French 75 are either captured or killed by the federal government, and the rest of the members disband and go into hiding. Bob lives a hermit life in a state of understandable paranoia, for which he self-medicates with booze, drugs, and perpetual bathrobe attire, and his daughter Willa is just trying to live a normal life of a high schooler, and like many high schoolers, thinks her dad's paranoid overprotectiveness is a little insane. Their mostly peaceful life in hiding is interrupted when the man who brought down the French 75, Colonel Stephen J. Lockjaw, played by Sean Penn, comes to Backton Cross with a military battalion. Circumstances have arisen such that Lockjaw must clean up some messes from his past, including capturing Willa and killing Bob. A former French 75 member named Deandra, played by Regina Hall, intercepts Willa and takes her on the run before Lockjaw's goons can find her, and Bob haplessly tries to reconnect with his comrades to find the rendezvous point so he can find his daughter and keep her safe. This is the third time I've covered a Paul Thomas Anderson movie in one of these, and something I talked about at length in my video on Licorice Pizza, and alluded to earlier in this video, is that all of his movies after There Will Be Blood have been a little harder for me to crack. I needed multiple viewings to wrap my arms around the movie and really understand what the movie is and how it's working. Now, I don't mind wrestling with a movie. I don't mind watching Inherent Vice 5 times and reading the Pynchon novel in order to better understand what PTA is going for. I'm willing to do that. I have done that. But I'm pleased to report that that's not really necessary here. With maybe one caveat. Put a pin in that. In the couple weeks leading up to release, I rewatched all 9 of Paul Thomas Anderson's movies in order, which I highly recommend and will be doing again. He started making movies so young and was so good immediately, and it was interesting to watch his style develop as he got older. From a 26-year-old who had watched a lot of Jonathan Demme, Martin Scorsese, and Robert Altman movies, to a 36-year-old who reportedly watched The Treasure of the Sierra Madre every night for weeks, to a late 40s guy who makes vibey hangout movies and a prestige romantic comedy for sickos. After watching all 10 of his movies in quick succession, I think One Battle After Another is both one of his most sophisticated movies, but also his most straightforward movie. Like, it has a plot, with very clear stakes and very clear character motivations and very real tension. One reason his movies are sometimes hard for me to crack is they're sometimes a little more opaque on plot and stakes, especially since There Will Be Blood. But not here. On the Big Picture podcast, Chris Ryan said this has much more in common with The Road Warrior than with Nashville, which is kind of surprising because PTA's movies are usually more Nashville. In his review for The Ringer, Adam Naiman noted the parallels with Terminator 2 and cited an interview that PTA gave years ago where he said this.
I enrolled in NYU and I went there for literally 2 days. I walked into this class and this teacher said, you know, if anyone is here to write Terminator 2, just walk out. Just get out of the door. What if I do want to write Terminator 2? What if someone sitting next to me wants to write? Terminator 2 is a pretty awesome movie.
He quit film school because they disrespected T2, and now he's made a movie that I won't say is like T2, but it's the closest thing to Terminator 2 that a Paul Thomas Anderson movie could ever be while still being a Paul Thomas Anderson movie. Speaking of which, the whole reason I watched all 9 of his movies, besides that they're awesome, is because I wanted to look for connections or common themes or things that seem to interest this guy in his storytelling, so I could know what to look for in this. Watching these in quick successions, you see that a PTA movie is about lonely, broken people looking for family, literal or otherwise. Sydney and John, Dirk and Jack and everyone in Jack's orbit, everyone in Magnolia, Barry, Daniel, H.W., Freddie, Lancaster Dodd, Doc, A lot of people in Inherent Vice. Reynolds Woodcock, Alma to a point, Alana for sure, Gary to a point, and Bob, Lockjaw, and Willa. The stakes in each of his movies are whether or not these lonely, broken people will find, maintain, or repair their connection to other people, so that hopefully by the end of the movie, they will be less lonely and less broken. I find narrative stakes most effective when they're a binary, when there's a pass-fail criteria. Will they blow up the Death Star or not? Will Sarah and John Connor survive and stop Skynet or not? In PTA movies, it's will these lost souls find each other or not? And that is a narrative binary, but it's sometimes more of a nebulous one. Sometimes it's definitely yes, sometimes it's definitely no, sometimes it's a mixed bag, and sometimes it's yes for now, but for how long, we're not really sure. What I find so clever about One Battle After Another is it takes these internal emotional stakes present in all of his movies and literalizes and externalizes them. Will Bob find Willa or won't he? Will this family be reunited and survive this dangerous ordeal and escape the sins of the father, or won't they? I said the movie was straightforward, but with a caveat. It opened 16 years ago and has a prologue of sorts set in the past, and the main storyline takes place in present day. But this prologue in the past is 32 minutes. We get 32 minutes of setup. A lot of interesting stuff happens, and it's all crucial place setting for what's to come later, both for stakes and for character stuff, but the story proper doesn't start until we cut to Chase Infinity's face, a voiceover saying that 16 years have passed, and a Steely Dan needle drop, which is one of 3 or 4 needle drops in the movie that are so effective that for the rest of my life, the songs in question will be forever associated with this movie. With apologies to Tony Soprano. The prologue is heavier on montage and more impressionistic than the rest of the movie. It also has a different main character, compromise and moral ambiguity, and a darker tone. A name I haven't mentioned yet is Teyana Taylor, who brilliantly plays a character named Perfidia Beverly Hills. She's a former member of the French 75, she is Willa's mother, who is conspicuously absent for most of the movie, and she is the main character of the 32-minute prologue. I find Perfidia to be a fascinating character, but also pretty challenging. She seems to be the most hardcore revolutionary in the French 75, and she appears to get sexually turned on by revolutionary violence. Not like hurting people, but, bombing power grids and unoccupied government buildings. That's what gives her her zest for life. That's what she lives for. And it leads to some complicated relationships with Bob and with Lockjaw. It's interesting what makes her tick. And it's interesting to consider why she's a revolutionary and what she's looking to get out of all this. What Bob seems to want out of his relationship with Perfidia is more in line with the typical Paul Thomas Anderson character, connection and family. But that's not what motivates Perfidia. When Stephen Lockjaw crosses paths with Perfidia, he is humiliated and beguiled by her. And their ensuing interactions are complicated and sticky, with complex power dynamics. It leads to some characters in the movie judging Perfidia harshly, but also muddies how much agency she actually has in these decisions for which she is judged. My point is the rest of the movie is straightforward, but the prologue is more challenging, mostly because Perfidia is a challenging, complex character. The ways that I had to wrestle with some of PTA's movies, the prologue kind of invites that wrestling. So the end result is a movie that is as sophisticated and complex as we've come to expect from PTA, but also one that is just so fun and funny and exciting and alive and very moving and cathartic. I think it's working on those levels because of the aforementioned stakes and tension in the writing, but also because of the filmmaking. Johnny Greenwood of Radiohead has been scoring PTA's movies since There Will Be Blood, and his music is often very percussive and rhythmic and propulsive, and that really works here, particularly in the climactic car chase. The way that cinematography and editing and music are working in tandem to build tension in the finale is incredibly effective filmmaking. My favorite piece of music in the movie, besides the needle drops, is this big orchestral piece that starts as a lone piano note and then builds to a loud swell. It plays 3 times in the movie. In The Social Network, that famous fuzzy piano piece also plays 3 times, and on the DVD commentary, David Fincher calls it their triptych. He knew that that was the key piece of music in the movie, so he won it for the opening credits, and then wanted to return to it at key times, during a tense deposition scene around the midpoint, and during the climactic fight with Eduardo. I'm not saying The Social Network invented leitmotif, but hearing Fincher talk about it in those terms as a triptych just made me think of when they decide to deploy this swelling orchestral piece in one battle after another. It's used in the opening shot, not unlike how The Social Network uses its key piece of music for the opening credits, and it's used again in the scene where Lockjaw realizes he needs to track down Bob and Willa, which sets the plot in motion, and then it's used again in the back half when a portion of that storyline reaches its climax. It works really well all 3 times, and it makes these key moments feel really big. One thing I was reminded of when I watched 10 PTA movies in a row is that I'm absolutely in love with how he moves his camera with music, how much the cinematography is in sync with Jonny Greenwood's score, how much the music and editing are in tandem and taking cues from each other. I never get sick of it, and it's a big reason why I keep coming back to his movies. I don't make this comparison lightly, but for me, it's like Scorsese, Kubrick, PTA as far as integration of music into his filmmaking. Integration with music aside, editor Andy Jurgensen had a pretty tall task here. For example, the prologue is 32 minutes, but I wonder if it was ever longer. I wonder if they went through a few iterations to pare it down, and maybe that's how it got to be more impressionistic. And I think the editing in the prologue is really threading a needle for how it's communicating crucially important place setting while still getting us to the main storyline as quickly as possible. And once we're in the main storyline, the editing task becomes how to sustain tension with quite a few narrative plates spinning. Early on, Willa leaves the house to go to a school dance, so they are not together when Bob gets a phone call that Stephen J. Lockjaw is on his way to Backton Cross. And from the time Bob gets that phone call until the final 5 minutes of the movie, there is like real sustained tension. We follow Bob, we follow Willow, and we follow Lockjaw as their paths cross or just miss each other. And eventually there's a 4th party involved in this game of cat and mouse, and the editing has to keep that all coherent and interesting and tense. That's really hard to pull off, and they do it. The script is tight, the editing is tight, and there is sustained tension that really comes to a head. Once we get to the last act, it is almost unbearably tense at times, particularly with the danger that Willa finds herself in. In some of these late sequences with Willa in real mortal peril, they do away with Jonny Greenwood's score entirely because silence is even more tense. And I know it's strange to be proud of a fictional character, but Willa was taken into hiding when she was a baby, so it's not immediately clear early on how much she understands of her dad's past and the threats that are out there and how much danger hangs over their entire lives. But when shit hits the fan, you see that Bob presumably prepared Willa to face these potential dangers, and she faces them so unbelievably admirably. She witnesses terrible violence firsthand and knows exactly how much danger she's in, and she's put in situations where I think I would just lay down and cry, but she's a fighter.
You're a goddamn fucking fighter, aren't you? I like that.
She keeps her wits about her amazingly, and she's cool-headed and brave and tough. Paul Thomas Anderson had been working on the script for 20 years, and once he decided it was finally time to make this, his very first tall task was finding Willa. And he found a largely untested actress in Chase Infinity, whose only previous credit is an Apple TV show. And she has to go toe-to-toe with Leo DiCaprio and Sean Penn. And then she has to carry the most tense scenes in the movie on her shoulders alone. And holy shit, is she up to the task. I can't believe this is her first movie. Elsewhere, this is Leo DiCaprio's best work since Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and honestly among his best work, full stop. And it's crazy to me that he has been more present in the Best Actor conversation. He's one of the most celebrated actors of all time, but he's still kind of weirdly underrated. As Bob, he's so manic, he's so high energy, he's a live wire, and he is so funny. There's physical comedy and enormous physicality in general. He has to act high, he has to pull off the intimidating dad routine. He's hapless, but he's trying so hard, and he's very touching in his quieter moments. The first time I saw the movie, I saw it with a group, and the first thing any of us commented on when we were debriefing in the theater lobby was Sean Penn. This is the most I've ever been impressed by Sean Penn performance, and he's won Best Actor twice. He also brings a lot of incredible physicality to how he walks and how he carries himself. On the big picture, Sean Fennessy identified that he's basically channeling Vince McMahon. On top of that, his face looks like burnt beef jerky, his voice sounds like he swallowed gravel, and he's got a Mike Flynn haircut. Sean Penn is one of 2 Best Supporting Actor nominees in the movie, and on first viewing he was the big standout, but on second, third, and fourth viewings, the other Supporting Actor nominee stood out to me more and more. Benicio del Toro plays a character named Sensei Sergio, a member of the Backton Cross community who runs a dojo where Willa learns martial arts. Benicio had to leave the set of the Phoenician scheme to come film his scenes here, and reportedly they were very rushed because of his commitments to the other Anderson director. On top of that, PTA has also talked about how the sequences with Sensei Sergio were very different in the script, but Benicio del Toro had some different ideas for his character and for how these sequences could play out. And despite their time crunch, they reworked these sequences based on del Toro's input. Which is wild to me because his scenes are some of the most effective in the movie and really illuminate what the whole movie is about. So maybe we have Benicio del Toro to thank for not only giving a beautifully empathetic performance, but also for shaping the movie into being as cohesive as it is. Put a pin in that. This is loosely adapted from the 1990 novel Vineland by Thomas Pynchon. Pynchon is widely considered one of the great American novelists of the 20th century, and his books are usually pretty complex and sprawling and unwieldy by design. Personally, I read 3 of his books in the last year, and I definitely found that to be the case. And for decades, it was thought that his books were unfilmable and unable to be adapted because they're so complex, sprawling, and unwieldy. And so far, PTA's been the only filmmaker bold enough to try, and he's done it twice. Real quick, the inciting incident that forces Lockjaw to seek out Bob and Willa is that he's invited to join an elite underground white supremacist group, and the existence of Bob and Willa threaten his application. And apparently this plotline is an invention of Paul Thomas Anderson, but it is also the most Thomas Pynchon aspect of the movie. Pynchon novels always include networks of secret underground nefarious groups working in the shadows, and even though this particular nefarious underground group is not literally a Pynchon original, its inclusion demonstrates that Paul Thomas Anderson really understands the material. Not just the existence of this group, but also the tone with which they're portrayed. PTA nails the Thomas Pynchon thing of making them scary and dangerous and powerful, but also entirely silly and worthy of ridicule. The book Vineland has a Bob character, it has a Willa character, it has a Lockjaw character, and it has a Perfidia Beverly Hills character in a slightly different form. So the bones of the book and the bones of the movie are pretty similar, but the book is about former revolutionaries who were active in the 1960s living in Ronald Reagan's 1980s and reckoning with what they had done and how the world had changed around them, and ultimately how their radical activism failed, and may have in fact made the world worse as it ushered in a major rightward shift under Reagan. Paul Thomas Anderson hasn't had a movie set in the present day in almost 25 years. Period pieces are kind of his bag, so I find it fascinating that he decided to update the setting of Vineland, which is implicitly kind of an interesting commentary on the rightward shift from the 60s to the 80s and the rightward shift from the 2000s to the 2020s. Writing Variety, Andrew McGowan noted some similarities and contrasts in the adaptation. Taking place in 1984, the book is a satirical comedy on America's shift from the 60s to the 80s. It reflects the failure of the hippie revolution to inspire change and that same generation's regression into Reagan-era conservatism. The Bob character is an archetype for a 1960s hippie 20 years later, ideologically castrated and dependent on the government he fought against. One battle after another, by contrast, doesn't lean quite as allegorical. It doesn't make a dichotomous statement about the two timelines' respective decades. The movie settings are relatively interchangeable, both appearing contemporary, if not eerily set 15 minutes in the future. Considering that the film was conceived several years ago, Anderson's depictions of federal government raids, aggressive approaches to deportation, and reckless law enforcement all feel unnervingly prescient for present-day America. As McGowan alludes, it's hard to ignore the real-world parallels between what's been happening in the United States for the last couple of years and Stephen Lockjaw using the federal militarized force at his disposal to descend on Bacton Cross under the guise of immigration raids. Once he finds out Bob and Willa are living there, he literally tells his guys, "Find me a reason to go to Bacton Cross." The French 75 not only failed to bring about any real societal change, but bringing down the French 75 was presumably what made Lockjaw's career. So the only material thing the French 75 did was strengthen their perceived enemies and put Lockjaw in a position where he's able to terrorize this community. Let's pull that pin out of the Sensei Sergio sequences. The movie opens with the French 75 infiltrating an immigration detention camp on the US-Mexico border and liberating the detainees. When we eventually get to the jump to the present day, we hear Perfidia's voice tell us,
16 years later, the world had changed very little.
Because they're still fighting the same battles, including and especially with immigration. It's interesting to contrast how the French 75 fought those battles and how Sensei fights those battles in present day. Bob goes to Sensei in desperation when he's on the run, trying to figure out the rendezvous point and reunite with his daughter. And Sensei very calmly takes Bob in and mentions that he runs something of a Harriet Tubman situation out of his house. And in a remarkable example of show don't tell, we slowly learn that Sensei runs a complex network of hideouts and tunnels and secret passageways to help families evade immigration detention. And you can kind of connect some narrative dots here. The French 75 liberated these people in this camp, but what happens next? The answer is Sensei and his cadre of people willing to help. Where the French 75 used guns and explosives and ostentatious but meaningless declarations of war, Sensei instead works behind the scenes with calm and care and dignity. Bob is thrust into this dangerous situation where he must step up and be the hero, and he trips over the very first hurdle. And it's only through Sensei that he's able to get out of this. Not only does Sensei himself rescue Bob multiple times, but he has a secret network of seemingly dozens of other people that are also willing to help Bob and help these other people being hunted and ultimately help keep families together. That fits so well with PTA's whole lost souls finding family motif that I can't believe that it apparently came from Benicio del Toro and may not have been in the original script. And I found all this stuff with Sensei deeply moving. The idea that in the face of an overzealous, borderline fascistic military force, there are people willing to help. At the end of the day, One Battle After Another's thesis seems to be, wow, the world is a dangerous and scary place. What can we do about it? And that's a question that spans generations. To again evoke Chris Ryan on The Big Picture, he said when you're young, you have the will but lack the wisdom to change the world. And when you're old, you have the wisdom but lack the will. Bob and Willa are meeting right in the middle of that. Bob and the French 75 aim to build a better world, but were kind of forced to give up. In the movie, Bob and Willa take up that fight again. The titular battles of the movie are shaping the world to be fit for your children, and then shaping your children to be fit for the world. It should be obvious this was my most anticipated movie of the year, so I've been trying to temper how much praise I heap on it, just to make sure I'm not so desperate to see a new color that I get ahead of myself. I know it's the best movie I saw last year, but how far are we going back? Acknowledging recency bias, right now I kind of think it's better than anything I saw not only last year, but in the last couple of years, which sort of forces it immediately into the best of the 2020s conversation. Killers of the Flower Moon came out in the 2020s, so I don't think it's the best movie of the decade, but I don't know, it could be in the running. I'm not doing a good job tempering my praise. It's the current odds-on favorite at the Oscars to win Best Picture, Director, Adapted Screenplay, Cinematography, and Editing. Those are 5 big prizes. Think what you want about the Oscars and their tastes, but I think a movie with Oscar-worthy cinematography, editing, writing, and directing is pretty remarkable. If it's able to win those 5, like Vegas thinks it will be the first movie to do so since Schindler's List. And that's a forever movie. I said in my Sinners video that I went to a lot of repertory screenings in 2025, and it got me thinking about longevity and the movies that have stood the test of time. What movies can still draw a crowd at a rep screening? What movies are remaining in the cultural consciousness? What movies are still in rotation and being promoted on Netflix and HBO Max even decades after release? What movies are still on lists of great movies and still generally thought of highly? What movies are the younger generations finding and keeping in the cultural consciousness? More importantly, what am I personally going to keep watching? Oscars or no Oscars, I definitely do see this lasting a while. I don't think it's the best of the decade because I don't really think it's better than Killers of the Flower Moon or Tar or probably not Oppenheimer and maybe not Sound of Metal, but I'm pretty confident that I'm going to watch One Battle After Another more than any of those other ones. Real quick, I didn't want to put this in the main section because it's like arguably spoilers, but vaguely, I want to say that I think Bob wrote the letter. The first few times I thought it was Perfidia, and maybe I was convinced because they had Teyana Taylor read it. But the 4th time I saw it, I thought it was a payoff of what Bob said to Sensei in the car. How he thought one day Perfidia would come back and be Willa's mom, and that Bob is not equipped to raise her alone. Bob thinks that he can't give Willa everything she needs, so in giving her this letter, he's trying to give her what she needs. Her mom. Telling her to change the world.